Excellent. Welcome back to CIS 76. It's been a while. How do you feel about the last couple weeks going through the various mini courses? And it's okay to say you're not done yet. Some of them are frustrating. Lots of information. Yep. But we'll be going through a lot more information. So you'll be able to try some of the things that you read about. It really was more of establishing a foundation for everything that's coming up next. So you'll see a lot of those tools again. You'll be working with them. You'll be learning a whole lot more. So, for the next couple of weeks, as I pull up the modules, for the next couple of weeks, we have chapters to get through. So we will be live. I believe there's a chapter, one of these modules that's going to take 2 weeks to accomplish. I don't remember if it's 5 or 6, but we'll get there. So, a format of the next couple of modules has a, like for example, Module 2, where we're at this week, has a Do I Know This quiz at the beginning. It is 0 points on purpose because I don't want you to feel like you have to do them, or if you do bad at them that it negatively affects you. I don't want that to be your the way you're going to operate through the course. So do the Do I Know This to see if you have a understanding of what's going to be in the chapter. It's a great way to gauge whether you need to do more research and more reading on the topics covered in the chapter, or maybe not. Maybe you're able to breeze right through and move along. Now, again, this is really about giving you all the information you need to not only pass the certification exam, but actually be able to do this in the real world. So again, there's the Do I Know These quizzes for every chapter. There's the lecture notes that I'll go through, and then the lab that we'll talk about after the lecture. So with that, let's get started. Like I said, Do I Know This? Should only take about 5 minutes to get through. If you're watching the recording, just pause it, do the quick little test, and then we move forward. Understanding ethical hacking and penetration testing. An ethical hacker is a person who acts as an attacker and evaluates the security posture of a network for the purpose of minimizing risk. And a non-ethical hacker, someone who gains unauthorized access to a target or a network, use the same tools to find vulnerabilities or weaknesses in a system or procedures, controls, or implementation that could be exploited by a threat source and exploit targets. The main difference between the two is their motive. Ethical hackers will report their findings to the vendor or the customer that they are helping to make more secure. non-ethical hackers are criminals. Penetration testing is necessary to find any possible paths of compromise before the bad guys do. So the things you'll be doing in this course really run a fine line between criminal activity and non-criminal. It's all based on the permission that you have, all based on the motive that you have. I want to make that clear right off the top. The things you'll be learning, the things you'll be doing, it all depends on the motive that you're doing it, on the permission that you have to do it. That will determine whether it's criminal or not. Obviously, we're here to learn to not be criminals, but to stop the criminals. And even if you were trying to learn this for criminal reasons, know that government agencies that have 3 letters in them already know all these things. You won't be wising up. They'll figure you out. Our current landscape changes frequently, almost every hour, with new zero-day attacks and threats appearing all the time. Our defenses must be able to utilize threat intelligence and automation to detect and mitigate threats quickly and effectively. Threats like ransomware and botnets utilize unprotected Internet of Things devices as just 2 simple examples of the many that continue to come out every day, every hour. The threats change as threat actors work to bypass defenses that we have put in place and find other ways to take advantage of the vulnerabilities in our networks and systems. The threat actors will vary in their types and motives. There's organized crime, which are well-funded and motivated groups that will typically use any and all of the latest attack techniques. You have the hacktivists, who make a point to further their beliefs, stealing data and revealing it to embarrass or financially affect the target. There's the state-sponsored attackers. Cyber war and espionage are expected to occur in cyberspace. And insider threats. Normal employees either tricked into divulging information, like mistakenly click on a link, or they're motivated by revenge or money. In truth, we can't stop everything. A state-sponsored attacker is someone like James Bond. You're not going to stop James Bond. He's going to get in. But we can do our best to protect against the script kiddies and people who are just scanning the open internet. We can make it harder for hacktivists to get in. We can also protect ourselves against insider threats that may try to get in. Testing methodologies ensure that testers assess the security posture of the correct network and systems without going off scope, which we'll talk about in a bit, by providing documentation of a specialized procedure that has been used by industry. For example, web applications test for misconfigurations, input validation issues, injection, and logic flaws. The test focuses on gaining access to the supporting databases through web application compromise. Network infrastructure evaluates switches, routers, firewalls, and other resources for things like authentication, authorization, and accounting. Wireless networks test to bypass the security mechanisms, break the cryptographic methods used to secure traffic, or create a detailed heat map of signal disbursement. Useful for things like Evil Twin. The physical facility We can't forget the physical realm. It is connected to our digital realm. They are one. So exposing weaknesses in the physical perimeter and mechanisms like guards, gates, and fencing. And of course, social engineering. Using phone calls, emails, websites, text messages to test users and see how they respond to situations. The terms black box, which means the tester has limited to no information. White box, tester has significant amount of information about the organization, the structure, the network. And gray box, a hybrid between black and white, are used to describe the perspective from which the testing is performed, as well as the amount of information that is provided to the tester. So if you're given a black box scenario, you're probably given like an IP address or a domain, and that's it. Or an address, no other information. A white box will tell you, here's the username and password, here's how many computers there are, here's the network map, the topology, all that kind of information, and gray is right in the middle. There are a number of testing methodologies that you can use, like the penetration testing execution standard. Part of PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, has a penetration testing guidance. There is a penetration testing framework. NIST has a special publication called 800-115 for guidelines on planning and conducting pen testing. There's the Open Source Security Testing Methodology Manual. And OWASP also has one for web apps. These are all resources that are available to you, the up-and-coming pen tester, that you should be familiar with because you'll be using these frameworks to launch your own attacks. Oops. One last thing is you definitely should have your own lab. Your ideal pen testing lab should be a closed network. Should have easily deployable and recovery images. Ideally, the more realistic it can be, the better. Having lots of monitoring tools to see when something crashes, you're able to determine why. Having multiple operating systems. That way you test them to see if your results are the same. Having duplicate tools. Having more than one tool that does the same thing to see, do you get the same result? And of course, tons of practice targets. Your lab can be something as simple as having a Linux VM that you use to connect to things like Hack the Box or Try Hack Me. You don't need to spend thousands of dollars on a beefed up laptop anymore because there's a lot of cloud infrastructure that you can use, including GCP, where you can build your own setup. You don't have to build it all internal. Any questions on chapter 1? Okay. As I said, every chapter has a do I know this? So go ahead and check that out. It's a quick little simple quiz. The most important phase of any pen testing assignment, any pen testing engagement that you have in your career, the most important is not getting in. Believe it or not. No, the most important phase is the planning and preparation. Without this critical step, and spending the most time in this critical step, you could easily run into problems with your client, with your boss, or even legal. And you really don't want to have a problem with any of those. Your deliverable, the thing that you give in order to get a paycheck, is your report. So in your report, you need to write it to the target audience. So who's your primary audience? Who are the subjects, the business units, or any other entity that's going to be assessed? You have to have some general points in mind. Besides the different characteristics of your target audience, the entity, individual's need for the report, the position of that individual who will be the primary recipient, the main purpose and goal of the pen testing engagement, the individual or the business's unit responsibility and the authority to make decisions based on your findings. Who is this going to be addressed to? The CISO, the CIO, the CTO, and who's going to have access to this report? Because it's going to have sensitive information. So first and foremost, who is your target audience for your report? Next would be the rules of engagement. This document specifies what conditions will the pen test be conducted. You must document and agree upon these rules with the client or the stakeholder. Here is just a sample of engagements and examples, and a Gantt chart used to demonstrate the process of a engagement. How long will the engagement run? How many hours? What day? Things are going to happen. All of this has to be pre-planned. All of this has to be established and be signed off by both you and the client before we even begin hitting our terminal and getting to work. Before we do any of that, we must get through this first. The next important thing is your communication escalation path. Having proper documentation to answer questions like, who is the contact for all the relevant stakeholders? How will you communicate with those stakeholders? How often do you need to interact with them? And in case of an emergency, who do you contact? Having secure channels for storage should also be listed in the communications escalation path. So not only do you need to write your report, because that is your main deliverable, to the right audience, you have to write out and get approval from your client the rules of engagement, how the pen test will happen. You also need to have a list of who gets contacted when and for what. Remember that you and your client must discuss how confidential data will be handled, including who will have access to the information. All information from a client should be removed before working on the next client to ensure sensitive information is not accidentally passed. We also have to talk about budget. How do you explain the overall cost for a pen test? Why do you need pen test if you have a technical and non-technical controls in place? Can you do it yourself? How do you calculate return on investment? On your end, you have questions to answer. How do you account for all items in pen testing to not go over budget? How do you write out your pricing? And how do you clearly show return on investment for a pen test engagement? There's also the point-in-time assessment. The big question here. Is the company doing better or worse? By looking at this chart. Is the company doing better or is it doing worse? It's actually hard to determine. Because things change over time. There's different machines. There's a variety of updates. The same machines may have different versions of patches. They may not all be uniform. Pen testing alone cannot guarantee the overall security of a company, as they will change over time. Achievable mitigation strategies paired with appropriate impact analysis and remediation must be discussed. What you do as a pen tester is not the end. There has to be continued work by the client. I don't know if you've seen this before. The common vulnerability scoring system. At first glance, it doesn't really make sense. But in a moment, we'll go through them. This system helps to clearly understand and effectively communicate the impact of the vulnerabilities discovered in order to prioritize remediation and understand timelines. This is an effective methodology that the industry has used as a standard that you should learn and use as well. Vulnerabilities are evaluated in 3 CVSS groups with a score of 0 to 10 that are assigned the intrinsic characteristics of a vulnerability constant over time. They don't depend on user-specific environment. There's the base group, the most important information and mandatory for obtaining a score. There's the temporal group, assesses a vulnerability as it changes over time. An environmental group, characteristics of a vulnerability taking into account the organizational environment. I know that's a lot. An example CVSS score has exploitability metrics, which is how the vulnerability can be exploited. So here we have the base score. 3.0. That's from 0 to 10. AV is the attack vector, the context in which a vulnerability can be exploited. And there's typically 4 options. It's either through the network, as it is here, adjacent, this would be an A instead, local, which would mean an L here, or physical, with a P here. So AV is not antivirus, it's the attack vector. Will this attack be over the network? Will it be on a computer adjacent? Will it be local or physical? AC is the attack complexity. The conditions beyond the attacker's control must exist in order to exploit the vulnerability. Is it low, like it is here, or is it high, with an H? PR is the privileges required. The level of privileges an attacker must have in order to exploit a vulnerability. Is it none with an N, low with an L, or H for high? This one is high. User interaction. Do you need the user to perform something in order to launch this attack? You're either going to get an N, like it is here, or R for required. The S is the scope. The impact on the system that's being scored. Either the system will be unchanged, or it will be changed by this vulnerability. This whole section is all about the exploitability metrics. Then we have another section called the impact metrics. They measure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. All of them have either a low, medium, or high value. So this vulnerability has a high impact on confidentiality, has a low impact on integrity, and a low impact on availability. The temporal group is not listed here in this example, but you have things like the exploit code maturity, remediation level, and report confidence. And there's also the environmental group. A couple of pointers in all that information is vulnerabilities are not exploited in isolation. It's often in a chain. Exploits cannot exist without a vulnerability. You normally have to have a vulnerability in order to have an exploit, not the other way around. There is no such thing as an entirely theoretical vulnerability. Because an exploit might not come as part of a vulnerability, it shouldn't be deprioritized. Pen testing might not always guarantee the identification of every single occurrence, where security control may be sufficient or insufficient. You, as the pen tester, should help the client take necessary steps to remediate any exploitable vulnerability within a reasonable period from the time you found it. That was all a mouthful. Disclaimers belong in your report. Standard disclaimers are like pen testing will be conducted on applications and systems that existed on blank date. The report is intended to provide documentation that your client will determine the best way to remediate any vulnerabilities. The report can't and won't protect against personal or business loss as a result of the use of the applications and systems therein. Also provide no warranties, representation, or legal certification concerning the apps or the systems that will be tested. Consulting lawyers will be useful with contracts. That's what they're for. Remember that you have limitations. Oops, I moved one slide too fast. Remember that you have limitations and you want to set them in your report. For example, operational limits. Like SQLi attacks could corrupt a production database. You may not want to do that on a production system. There might be specific technology in the organization, like specific equipment or unique equipment. That might be a constraint for you. Your skill set can be a limitation. For example, I'm not really good at programming. That is a limitation that I have. And anything that are out of scope due to their performance or criticality. You always want to communicate any technical constraints with the stakeholders before doing the test. And there's a bunch of support resources that I listed in the notes for you to look at. Now this slide. Understanding the legal concepts of pen testing. It goes without saying that you have to be very aware of different legal concepts related to pen testing and local laws to ensure you're not violating any laws. Because like I said, you walk a super fine line between doing things that are criminal and not. So we have contracts. One of the most important documents in a pen test. It specifies the terms of agreement. It specifies how you're going to get paid. Clear documentation of the services that are going to be performed. This document must be very specific. It must be easy to understand without ambiguities. Legal advice from a lawyer is always recommended. Your customer may engage its legal department to review the contract. You must have written authorization. You want to have those signatures from proper signing authorities for your contract. That written authorization has to have your work performed along with any third-party provider, like an internet service provider, a cloud service provider, or any other external identities or entities. Again, you are walking a super fine line. The scope of work. This document specifies activities to be performed during the pen test. For example, the project timelines, like that Gantt chart. Delivery schedules, the scope of work performed, location of work if it's in a geographic area. Special technical or non-technical requirements. The payment schedule. Miscellaneous items that are needed to be listed and tracked because they could all pose problems during the engagement. The scope of work can be part of the master service agreement or be standalone. The master service agreement are used to quickly negotiate the work performed. This agreement allows the same terms to not be renegotiated every time work has to be performed. These are beneficial for a client who will know you and will be working on a recurring basis. There's also the non-disclosure agreements, a legal document and contract between you and the client. This specifies and defines confidential material, knowledge, and information that should not be disclosed. NDAs are classified as unilateral, that only one party discloses certain information to the other party. There's the bilateral, that's two-way, and multilateral for 3 or more parties. All this sounds boring. Completely understand. But it is super important to know these things, because this is how you can land in jail. 2 more things that you need to keep in mind are your export restrictions. For example, there was an arrangement set up where you couldn't use cryptographic software or encryption technologies in certain countries. There's also corporate policies that you need to take into question. I know ethical hacking just doesn't sound as fun right now, but this is all important to get through before we hit the keyboard. Now, we move on to scoping. Scoping is one of the important elements in the pre-engagement task, along with everything else we just covered. You not only have to carefully identify and document all the systems, the apps, and networks that are going to be tested, but you also have to determine any specific requirements and qualifications needed to perform the tests. The scary thing. The broader the scope, the more skill and requirements you will need. So we have scope creep. The uncontrolled growth of a project scope, also known as the kitchen sink syndrome, requirement creep, function creep. This can put you out of business. So, major red warning. Scope creep is encountered when there's poor change management in pen testing, ineffective identification of what technical or non-technical elements will be required in a pen test, or poor communication among stakeholders and the pen testing team. Now, not all scope creep can be bad. A satisfied client may ask you to do additional testing or technical work. So if you engage with a client and after a request for proposal, they want additional work, then you might need to get a scope of work. When it comes to your first job, you really want to make sure you stay within that first job and its requirements and not let it grow. You want to take that first job from beginning to end, and if it works, everything went well and they want more, then okay, let's talk about more. You don't want it to happen during the thing, because like I said, the broader the scope, the more skills you have to have. There are 2 main types of assessments that you'll be doing. The goals are objective based, where the organization and the client, organization or the client and you agree on a specific goal or outcome. These are important to make sure that they're narrow and precise in scope. There's also the compliance based, where you're hired to ensure that the client meets specific regulations like PCI DSS, HIPAA, or FedRAMP, just 3 examples. Again, coming back to those 3 boxes. Your categories of a pen test can be you know absolutely nothing, or just very minimal. You know everything, or in between. You also have to help with risk management. Because risk is really the big thing that we're doing here. That's what we're bringing out and we're showing the client is their risk. So they can accept the risk that you showed, and they're just gonna accept that they have a vulnerable system and it's out in the internet and there's nothing they're gonna do about it. There's mitigation, where you can reduce the risk, either offensively control, like reducing or eliminating the vulnerability, or defensive, responding to its threat. Depending on that situation, we can do things either at the business unit level, the management, or the board. There is the sharing, shifting portion of risk responsibility or liability to other organizations. Know that there are a couple of laws, like GLBA and HIPAA, who prohibit sharing responsibility. There's transference, where we transfer risk to another entity, which is like buying insurance. There's the avoidance, modify or cease the risk-causing activity. And of course, monitoring, looking at the overall risk and continuing to watch for it. There are some regulations that you need to be well aware of. Again, it all depends on what work you'll be doing. The heart of financial services, like banks, credit unions, lending institutions, businesses, their heart is not in money, even though it says financial. It's really in the customer and transactional information, as financial assets can be replaced. Keeping customer information secured is necessary to establish and maintain trust between the community and the financial institution. If you are working with any financial institution, you need to be familiar with the Graham-Leach-Billy Act, or GLBA, the Federal Financial Institution Examination Council, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. GLBA defines a financial institution as any institution whose business of which significantly engage in financial activities. This applies to anything from check cashing, payday lenders, non-bank lenders, technology vendors providing loans to their client, debt collectors, courier services, professional tax preparers, and retailers that issue branded credit cards, ATM operations, credit reporting agencies. If you deal with money, you need to be well aware of GLBA. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is responsible for enforcing GLBA to firms that are not covered by federal banking agencies, the Security and Exchange Commission, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and state insurance authorities, including tax preparers, debt collectors, loan brokers, real estate appraisers, and non-bank mortgage lenders. So if you're working for anything that deals with money, you need to be well aware of all of those things. If you are dealing with health, then HIPAA is your thing. That is the regulation you need to be well aware of. HIPAA security rule has 3 modifications that expanded the scope of that law. There's the 2009 Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act, the 2009 Breach Modification Rule, and 2013 modification to HIPAA privacy, security enforcement, and breach notification rules under HITECH, which was the first one I mentioned, Act, and Generic Information Non-Discrimination Act, and Omnibus Rule. Pen testing is not just let me get into a computer. There's lots of outside information that you need to be well aware of. There needs to be a clarification on who has to follow HIPAA. You have the healthcare providers, which are doctors, clinics, outpatient services, counseling, nursing home and hospice services, pharmacy services, medical diagnostic and imaging services, and durable medical equipment. Health plan. These are all the HMOs, government health plans, government programs that pay for healthcare like Medicare, Medicaid, military and veterans programs. Healthcare cleaning houses. Entities that process non-standard health information as it receives from another entity. And also business associates. Anybody that performs certain functions or deals with activities involving the use of private health information. So that can be legal, accounting, consulting, data aggregation, management, admin, accreditation, any financial services that creates, receives, maintains, transmits, or accesses, or has the potential to access health information. If your business deals with handling finances for health, you are dealing with both GLBA and HIPAA at the same time. Am I done? No. There's another. PCI DSS. The Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council. Long name, but it's made of Visa, MasterCard, Discover, JCB International, and American Express. This group protects cardholders against misuse of their personal information and minimizes payment card channel losses. PCI DSS must be adopted by any organization that transmits, processes, or stores payment card data, or that directly or indirectly affect the security of a cardholder. Payment card brands can levy fines and penalties against non-compliant organizations or revoke their authorization to accept payment cards. So your grocery store who lets you use credit cards, they have to abide by PCI DSS. The 7-Eleven down the street has to abide by PCI DSS, or should abide by PCI DSS. All these different laws have different terms. So, depending on your client will require you to do your homework. This is why all this has to go first before we touch actual attacks. In any regulation, like the three that we covered, we need to remind ourselves of things like data isolation or network segmentation. Now, relative to, for example, PCI DSS, you should have a completely isolated network that handles the payment card processing from everything else. Most of the regulations mandate solid password strategies, like not using the vendor supplied defaults, the password length, the complexity, the session timeout, multi-factor, and key management, like SSH keys. There are several limitations you may encounter when performing client-based pen testing, such as limited network and storage access. PCI DSS has those limitations that you'll encounter. So you should have if you're dealing with PCI DSS, you should have in your report a statement of limitations section that documents any restrictions imposed on testing, such as designated testing hours, bandwidth restrictions, special testing requirements, and so on. Any questions on Chapter 2? If you got bored by that, I'm sorry. But this is what keeps us from going to jail and losing our career. This is the stuff that separates a professional from an amateur. An amateur is not going to do this type of research. A professional will. Because a professional understands that you have to follow certain laws and abide by them because you want to keep your career. So, seeing no questions, we will then move on to the work for the week. This week, I have you listening to The Art of War. It's an hour long. You could take it for a drive and listen to the whole thing in one shot. That's how I do it. The next thing that you'll need to do is to create and submit drafts of the documents we talked about, like the scope of work, the master agreement, an NDA. It is perfectly fine to Google. It's perfectly fine to work together. Some of these documents are hard to find. I am not expecting a lawyer to look through this by next week. I don't expect you to contact a lawyer for this. It's not that part of the assignment is not something that is for my benefit. It's really for your benefit. I want to help prepare you for the real world by starting to create a draft that you could use as a starting point when you do your first pen testing job. Because these questions are gonna come out from your client. And you want to have something over nothing, because your client may have a legal department who can help you write the rest. But you don't want to start from scratch or look at your client like a deer in the headlights and go, I don't know what I need to do. So again, I'm not looking for a completely polished NDA or a completely and accurately written out master service agreement for something. We're just writing a draft. You will write a real thing later in life when you start doing this for a living. You'll have those at the ready. This is just the start. And that's what I want you to create and submit. The start. If you have an idea, now that we talked about different things, you have an idea of what you want to do, then you add on this. So, yes, it is a rough draft NDA. Yes. With this last one, it's really hard to find a company who doesn't do PCI DSS. Have you found a company who doesn't do credit card? I can't think of one off the top of my head. So that would be one of two that you can find on how would you detail, how you would write out. And again, I'm not asking for a monster essay, a 20-page essay. I'm just saying, what would you do just initially to make sure that your client would meet the regulation of like PCI DSS? Or if you're thinking, hey, I might want to do pen testing for a bank. Well, there's two right there, GLBA and PCI DSS. If you're thinking of helping defend hospitals from cyber attacks that are occurring right now during the pandemic, well, HIPAA. Check out HIPAA. Check out HITECH. Again, it's a rough draft. I'm not going to send you off to 7-Eleven and see if they're compliant. We're not going to do that. Number one, we don't have the permission. So we're not going to do something that's criminal. This is also a rough draft. Again, preparing you for the real world. Putting yourself in that mindset. Helping you think through what will you do to meet two of the laws that we cover, two of the regulations that we talked about. Because you really don't want to have that thought, that conversation when you have the client in front of you asking you, please help us. You want to have answers. You want to have something ready. And that's what we're really going to be doing in this course, is preparing you for the real world. We'll get to the fun stuff, to the fun technical things soon enough. But this is important. This is critical to ensuring you have a career and a positive reputation. So I completely understand that this sounds boring. I completely understand that this sounds tedious and not fun, and you'll be dragging your feet. I understand, because I did that. I dragged my feet over these things because I think this is boring. I want to go hacking. But that's the difference in level of maturity, is when you want to do that and you don't want to do this paperwork, you're not going to get far. You have at least something together. You can bring that to the table, and your client can help you through the rest. So, listen to The Art of War. I hope that link still works. It should. It's YouTube. Yes, it does work. Sweet. Listen to The Art of War. Create some drafts about the documents we talked about. And choose two of the laws and regulations that we covered. And write out how you would help a imaginary client to meet those regulations. Does that make sense? Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. Then with that, have a good evening. I will stop the stream.